Giveaway time! It is time for our 140,000 subscriber Lego giveaway. Right here are Legos. This is a dog. I wish I could give you guys the dog. I'm just kidding. But I am doing a giveaway for 140,000 subscribers. Right here are 3 Lego Star Destroyers. I will be giving one of these away to each of the 3 winners. For the patrons, there's an exclusive giveaway for you that I'm calling the 501st giveaway. Down below, there will be a link so that you can participate in the Star Destroyer giveaway. As for the Patreon one, there is a Patreon-specific giveaway on the Patreon. Otherwise, go down below and sign up for this awesome giveaway. I can't wait to give these Star Destroyers away because they are kind of larger than my apartment. Anyways, I'll see you guys at 140,000 subscribers. Thank you all for all of your amazing support. Enjoy the video.
Hello.
Our story begins inside of Maul's meditation chambers. Pre Vizsla was rounding the troops up outside. Crimson Dawn was growing. Savage was somewhere nearby, and all the Mandalorians could think about was attacking their own. Maul was focused on a far greater plan. He knew that the outcome of the Clone War would reveal itself soon. If he could get such a revelation, then he certainly wouldn't have any issue finding his throne in the new order that was to come. Maul's eyes were forced shut. He couldn't stop his raging mind from slipping into different paths or obstructions. He wanted so much so quickly, but he needed to be more patient now. Maul had worked arduously to return from the dead, and this was his opportunity to take the stand. But there remained one troubling concern for him. How? Sidious was in control of everything. To what extent, even Maul didn't know. But he did know that Mandalore was nothing but a temporary obstacle, so he could rally a fighting force. Thanks to Death Watch's support, their warriors would be fine additions to his criminal syndicate, but still much remained a question for him. While he was sitting mind-numbingly silent, he could feel familiarity. A green mist encircled him, and an echoey voice crawled into his mind. Mother. He whispered out. Maul's eyes remained closed, but he could see Talzin appear before him. He called to her, telling her that he thought she had died. She told her son to quiet his mind and listen. The Force was very powerful. She, like Sidious, knew of ways to preserve life, which is what she was doing at the current moment. The Night Sisters shall return, but that wasn't why she was coming to him. Talzin had a vision of her son's lonely and isolating death on Tatooine. In what context, she didn't know. But all she knew is that he was an old master, one without a place in the galaxy and one who had fallen victim to his eldest rival. Talzin wanted more for her child, and she understood what Maul could become capable of. Sidious feared what Maul could become, and so she imparted knowledge to him. The first of such knowledge was the imprinting of coordinates that would identify where he needed to go. Maul felt pain. The imparting of such knowledge felt like the searing of a cast iron marking into the inner workings of his brain. Talzin made herself more visible. In his mind's eye, he looked at her, and he saw her studying his reaction. Maul, in said mind's eye, opened his eyes, and knew where he was supposed to go. But how would he get there? She spoke rhythmically, and her echoing voice stretched out to either side of his head. As a product of the Sith and the Night Sister clan, he could become more than Palpatine could ever dream of. His torment of him was to ensure Maul could never eclipse his own power. Sidious knew that revealing himself would only be an error. Sidious knew Maul existed, but it was time to ensure that he forgot he returned. Maul didn't understand, and perhaps he wouldn't for some time, but Talzin needed her son to trust her. He listened, as she told him in Sith legend, like the Jedi's Chosen One, there was a Sithari, an individual that would bring darkness to the galaxy. Son of Dathomir, she called out to her child. He was the key to true control over the galaxy. He could and would have the chance to rip the Sith and Jedi from their place in said galaxy, but the patience he needed was not what he currently possessed. He must go to Morabon, following which he must traverse galaxies. Only then would he have the true power to stop the Jedi and the Sith. He didn't understand, still, but she told him to listen with his mind, not his ears, to trust with his soul, not his heart. The Force would guide him. He was a child of their clan, and the Force had guided them for millennia. It was time he returned home and began the next leg of his journey. Maul had so many more questions for Talzin, but they were cut short when she vanished and his eyes truly opened, looking at the edge of the tent and the Mandalorian camp. How could he possibly? Then he came up with a sense of understanding. as if he had already had the answers, but didn't possess the trust in himself to fully commit to the idea. Now he did. Mandalore could not be attacked. It was a temporary victory. Now that he aligned with the criminal organizations, he could leave Pre Vizsla to his own devices, but instead of ruining his rapport with the Mandalorians of Death Watch, he would give them an alternative. Maul would speak highly to the other Mandalorians before informing them that Mandalore could not be taken now. If they wanted true and total control over the planet, then they would need to wait. Vizsla, who was already eager to betray Maul, had enough of this and proposed his own invasion of the capital city, without the help of Crimson Dawn. This little schism was very planned, and it gave Maul a chance to tell the warriors openly that when they failed, Crimson Dawn would have their back and they could come home to them. Maul and Crimson Dawn understood what it took to capture Mandalore. Vizsla would lead their brethren to a suicide. The Mandalorians didn't heed such warnings. In the meantime, for Maul, he would encourage leaders of Crimson Dawn to maintain their posts and continue building up forces. He and his brother had a very important mission to complete, for in the time it took for them to complete it, they would have themselves a new era to champion their criminal regime in. Maul trusted Talzin fully, and so he would follow what his mother said to him. Maul and Savage would lead the frontline command post for Crimson Dawn shortly after Death Watch did. Savage was really concerned with this new change of direction, but Maul told him exactly as Mother Talzin had told him, to listen with his mind, not his ears, and to trust with his soul, not his heart. Pre Vizsla was expendable as it was. The Mandalorians that survived would return looking for leadership. It would be through that failure that Crimson Dawn would build loyalty, strength, and warriors with true battle experience. Maul cited how important it was for Crimson Dawn to have Death Watch members. They would come back. The Duchess's security may have been weak, but it was numerous. Without the numbers of a multitude of criminal organizations and the blunt force assault that Vizsla would go for, it would only force he and his Death Watch to lose favorability. The Duchess would remain the popular political representative of the planet, and that was fine in Maul's mind. His revenge could afford to wait a few more years. Maul and Savage would levy a lot of trust into the leaders of criminal syndicates that united under the banner of Crimson Dawn. They were given one mission: build their armies, construct forces that could eradicate their foes, and that was it. The worst part is, because Maul was leaving a lot of these leaders, they were fearful that they would start a civil war amongst themselves. After all, these were criminals that had been rivals for decades to centuries. They had generational feuds that needed to be quenched, and without a middleman, those alliances could fall apart really quickly. However, there was one positive side to this. It incentivized the syndicates to build their armies and militaries faster, because they believed if civil war did erupt between the factions of Crimson Dawn, it would be the strongest of them to succeed in the aftermath. So the path for each of these leaders was, if Maul returned, they had a stronger united force. If war broke out before he did, then whoever was the strongest would rule the Outer Rim. Both deals were good for any of the syndicates, so they were trusting the direction they were about to take. Maul, on the other hand, following Mother Talzin's instructions, would go straight to Moraband, where he would seek knowledge of the Sithari, so he could learn more about that path. Because Maul was unfamiliar with Sidious's habits or those of Tyrannus, he didn't intend to stay here that long. Most of what he and his brother did were secure artifacts, holocrons, and even a couple of relics that had physical usage. Aside from Sidious or Tyrannus possibly returning, the big reason Maul didn't want to stay on Moraband is because he was unsure of how to get to Peridia. That was the biggest burden for him, and it would continue to be for the years coming. Maul would struggle to get to Peridia right up until a month before Order 66, but his lack of interference in galactic events led to many unforeseen events. Due to Crimson Dawn not interfering on the attack on Mandalore, Death Watch found mild success, but it was short-lived. The Mandalorian Guard may have not been trained in the traditional Mandalorian way, but they were still Mandalorians. They were able to, due to a blunt force attack by Vizsla, get the Duchess to a bunker as well as the citizens. Many of the bunkers of the Civil War still remained, so they were used. Thanks to a duo of Jedi led by Obi-Wan Kenobi, they were able to rout Death Watch, while also killing Pre Vizsla in the process. The Darksaber was given back over to the people of Mandalore and their leader. Satine therefore was able to maintain control over Mandalore and the Neutral Systems Coalition, which would lead to more trouble in the future. The survivors of the Death Watch assault returned to Crimson Dawn territory, And because Maul had promised them refuge, they began working arduously with the military forces and recruiters of the Criminal Syndicates. They had lost. For Death Watch, this would be for revenge. Mandalore surviving the attack from Pre Vizsla allowed Satine to reunite with Bo-Katan, which was semi-pleasant considering those who survived and didn't escape were captured, like her. But Satine's impact on the end of the Clone War would redirect the strength of the coming Empire. Satine's survival didn't stop Order 66, but it gave Obi-Wan a place of refuge, because Sidious was very unaware of Kenobi's intermingling outside of the Jedi Order. There were also a couple minor changes that turned into major difference makers. The first being that Ahsoka never left Coruscant. She wasn't involved in anything, because Mandalore was secured, Bo-Katan never went to look for her. This also meant that she never had a reunion with Skywalker before he became Vader. The entire 501st was on Coruscant for Order 66, which did affect Rex, but with Anakin acting on the orders from his new master, Rex followed along. He had a moment of resistance, but because he was around his brothers when Order 66 was executed, he didn't have a true moment to find Fives and stop himself. Rex and Jesse would be killed by Obi-Wan and Yoda when they returned to Coruscant before their respective fights with Sidious and Vader. Satine's survival led to the Empire having a political rival. It wasn't like Satine didn't become a target for assassinations, but similar to Padme, Satine without an invasion of Mandalore had plot armor. The Neutral Systems Coalition provided an alternative, one that wouldn't have been as appealing without Satine. While there were reports of the Jedi intermingling on Mandalore because of the invasion from Death Watch, the Empire could not send troopers into Mandalorian territory because it would break the neutrality agreement signed between the Republic and the Coalition. Now, yes, Palpatine could send Imperial troops into Mandalore airspace and break past a treaty that no longer stood, because the Republic no longer stood, but he could not afford to politically. The Neutral Systems added an entirely different dimension of political battleground to the post-Clone War galaxy. The Coalition was a stark contrast to the Confederacy or the Republic. They offered a peaceful choice. They offered an alliance, one built on trust and on trade. The Empire was cracking down hard on planets that were former Confederacy, and many people saw the new Empire wanted that. However, the Coalition had this nice way of assisting in relief efforts while also punishing. These punishments weren't harsh, but they were like restrictions. People couldn't mass-produce weapons, have steady militaries or militias, and a couple other things. But these restrictions were far more welcoming than Imperial troopers being sent in with their walkers and oppressing people with curfews and enforcing the new chain code system that was getting planted in by Admiral Rampart. As noted by a couple Imperial senators, it was clear that Palpatine was becoming fearful of his political presence. Not everything had gone perfectly as he had hoped. Satine not dying in his multitude of assassination attempts certainly wasn't helping him, and an emperor was far worse than a born-to-lead duchess. So many people around the galaxy were familiar with the antics of Satine and Palpatine. One was a selfless monarch, and the other was a selfless leader of the Republic. However, the title of emperor entailed something else, something new. What that was, the people didn't know. And now that the Separatists were truly gone, having someone assassinate Satine wouldn't just work. See, before the Clone War, and even throughout it, assassinations were feasible, but targeting someone as pure as Satine wasn't, because everyone would know it was the Empire that did it. She'd amounted the Coalition to a level of galactic immunity. It would take something from another side to quell her rise to this level of power. Sidious could not be responsible for that fall. During all of this, Maul and Savage had been learning all the information they could from the Sith relics they had. Their trip through hyperspace was relatively uneventful. They had found that they could use a pod of Purgle to transport themselves to Peridia, which is what they did. The difficult part would be getting back. But for the main part of their stay on Peridia, they would interact with the Great Mothers and the Zepho that had been long established on the world. These lessons, through ancient knowledge, would bestow Maul and Savage with great powers, ones that made them remarkable feats of the Force. Before ever returning to the known galaxy, the Great Mothers would gift the brothers a new start. Using their magic, they would remove their metallic limbs and replace them with real ones. This connected both Zabraks back to their full potentials, and gave them the chance to harmonize with aspects of themselves that had been lost in the absence of their missing limbs. Savage was becoming stronger than Maul by this point, but with the full return of his full body, Maul eclipsed his brother's raw strength. The two would be on Peridia for longer than they cared to be. The exchange between brothers and the Great Mothers was the return to Dathomir for the mothers and the power gifted to the brothers. Truthfully, training on Peridia was probably the best thing either of them could have ever gotten. Neither wanted to be there, and that was a simple irony of it all. This was proof of their need to be here. Maul wanted to raise his criminal empire, and it turned out that to raise one, he needed to find his inner compass and raise himself first. With this time, in the years that passed by a galaxy away, Maul reached his full potential. He was now more powerful than Sidious, and his apprentice was coming into his own full power too. The brothers sparred for hours daily on Peridia, and they were almost unstoppable in their own respects. A hulking beast with swings that could knock down even the most powerful adversaries, and Maul, the speed and ferocity of a Sith not seen in generations, equating to some of the great Siths of the ancient era. The brothers were able to finally return to the galaxy when a pod of Purgles stopped at Peridia for a short stay. Most pods of Purgles came here to die, but every so often not all the space whales did die, and it was in this pod that the brothers, Great Mothers, and a few of the deceased Dathomiri could return to their home. Maul and Savage would take the Great Mothers to Dathomir, where they could restart their fallen clan. By the time they returned, much change had happened. Mother Talzin was killed before they ever left the regular galaxy by Mace Windu, but now, in the era of Empire, there were multiple factions gunning for control. Satine and the Coalition were still politically strong. They'd secured imperial systems, and despite having no real military power, the Empire and its Emperor were still trying to figure out a way to seize control. It's not that the Coalition didn't have any military, but because of how temperamental imperial politicians became, it seemed like the necessary precaution to have a standing one. Palpatine was stuck in a political bind. A lot of galactic resources traveled through the routes established by the Coalition. This was done before the end of the Clone War. It's why he wanted Satine dead so badly. Her removal would have given the Empire the incentive to take a hold of these trade routes and connections before the Coalition could get their hands on them before the end of the war. But now that about half the galaxy was reliant on trade routes that were under the control of the Coalition, they couldn't really take that territory without disrupting everything. In the Outer Rim, with a Cold War seizing control over the Core, Inner Rim, and Mid Rim, the Criminal Syndicates were at full power. They'd been recruiting for the past 4.5 years. Since the Clone War, they'd been building their forces. Their military wasn't comparable to the Republic of old, or even the current standing Empire, but they did have millions of troops and thousands of new vessels. By new, this didn't mean they were using shipyards to build their own fleets. Rather, they had scavenged what they could. It was a combination of Republic, Separatist, and old warships. These combined fleets were what they could get their hands on, and it propelled Crimson Dawn to be ready for combat. But as per usual, the Outer Rim mimicked the regular galaxy, and without Maul and Savage, mostly Maul, Crimson Dawn was in the middle of its own Cold War. The Syndicates had pulled away from each other. This was mostly done because the Zygerians were trying to get their hands in the pot, but it wasn't really working for their own criminal interests. All it really did was stir up tension with Crimson Dawn and the other syndicates within it, and because all the syndicates' power was exponentially stronger than it had been, they were ready to pounce on each end. Maul's return came at the perfect time. A longtime Maul ally, Dryden Voss, had been keeping the ranks tight for him, and he was the only reason Crimson Dawn didn't fumble their opportunity. Maul's return brought an end to the criminal Cold War almost immediately. He did get a slight refresher on the galactic political developments. Learning of Order 66, what happened to the Jedi, and so on was very enjoyable for the self-proclaimed Sithari. But their mission had only just begun. As he had predicted, the Vizsla-led Mandalorians would lose in Sundari, and now he had an army of loyal Mandalorians ready to conquer their home back, with his guidance of course. Especially without the Darksaber, their barbaric minds were lost. They needed leadership, and Maul and Crimson Dawn were that leadership. Crimson Dawn's military was ready for an assault as well. While Maul was a little skeptical about going after Mandalore, especially in this new political environment, he saw the potential. But if he could sow destruction in the Coalition, then taking his fight to the Empire shouldn't be much of a challenge. Maul was searching for political fallout, and then the surprise of another full-blown war. There was a sense of confidence within him, but he felt like he could kill Sidious and whoever his new apprentice was with very little problem, let alone having Savage by his side. He just needed to figure out where to strike. The invasion of Mandalore would blindside the neutral systems, and because, unlike the Empire, Crimson Dawn didn't need to protect territory, they sent most of what they had. What this simply meant is the Empire and the Coalition were in a Cold War. Their fleets were stationed at trade routes, and they allowed trade to go through with very tight oversight. Crimson Dawn wasn't a part of that. There wasn't anyone in the Outer Rim that could legitimately target Crimson Dawn territory and attack it, not that anyone even wanted to as it was. So Crimson Dawn could afford to move a majority of their forces in the Mandalore airspace if they wanted. Once they began a war, then sure, different story, but they weren't beginning one. It was also because of this Cold War that when the heavy artillery on the exterior of the Sundari Dome started to open fire into the air, that the command deck inside the city called to their allies and told them that the Empire had broken the treaty. It was one simple miscommunication that got out before Crimson Dawn jammed their communication array, and it was one that opened the floodgates. Instead of a galaxy watching a third faction completely upend the state of one planet, the entire galaxy started a war, because the Coalition attacked the Empire almost immediately after this transmission went through, and because the Empire, especially Palpatine, never expected a true attack from the Coalition, they were caught completely flat-footed. Total war began the moment Mandalore went silent. The scene capital of the Coalition had been targeted by the Empire, and the Coalition responded with hostility. On Mandalore itself, Maul stood inside his custom Kosar warship. Next to him was Dryden Voss and Savage. Maul stood with his arms behind his back and a shadow over his eyes. He smiled and watched war unfold in Sundari. As it turns out, according to Gar Saxon, the Duchess wasn't present. He told Maul that chances are she was at her castle on Kalevala, where her family residence was. Maul turned to the deckhand and told him to take him to Mandalore's moon. When the ship arrived, Maul was escorted down to the surface by a wing of Star Viper attack fighters. When his shuttle landed, he walked out and looked at Castle Kryze. What Maul didn't suspect was the refugee who had called this castle his home. When he walked in, he was surprised to see a grizzled Obi-Wan Kenobi. Savage grabbed his lightsaber and Maul shook his head, telling him to go and find the Duchess and whoever else called this castle home. Maul didn't hesitate as he lunged forward, igniting his staff lightsaber and thrusting it at Kenobi, whose weapon ignited. He defended himself, but Maul could instantly feel the difference. Sparring with Savage was so familiar to him that fighting with someone who wasn't obsessively gaining strength was an interesting change. Maul threw himself aggressively at Obi-Wan, who defended every strike he could, but he was instantly thrown on the back pedal. All of Obi-Wan's training was still there through muscle memory, but he hadn't used his saber since defeating Skywalker and Mustafar. He had his life here with his wife and their adopted children, the twins. Maul didn't know that, but when he heard screaming from the other room, he could see Kenobi's face drop. Their duel wasn't long like Maul wanted it to be. He simply outclassed Kenobi in every single way. His obsessive training, his desire for revenge had plagued his mind, and now he was just simply too powerful. Obi-Wan slipped, and Maul slashed him across the leg and kicked him backwards, stepping around him and dipping the edge of his lightsaber into the ground and walking around his prey. As he did, Savage threw Satine out into the hall of the throne. Bo's helmet was then tossed to the ground and crushed under Savage's boot. Maul looked over at the twins. He laughed quietly, but that quiet hum burned louder like an inferno. He told Obi-Wan that he was so close to freedom from the Jedi path. He should have chosen the darkness. He should have chosen a more quiet home. Maul told Savage to dispose of the twins, which would be done before Kenobi and Satine. Following that, Satine would be killed, slowly and painfully. And because Maul wanted Obi-Wan to fully embrace his own physical pain, his legs were removed. Some of the Syndicate soldiers came in and strung Obi-Wan up from the ceiling as Maul watched Obi-Wan wither internally. He couldn't do anything, not without his hands or his legs. As for his hope, well, it was crushed in the 4 lost souls that were scattered across the once pristine floors of Castle Kryze. Savage asked why they were letting Obi-Wan live, and Maul said they weren't. He wouldn't ever be a second thought to them again. His loyalty to the light and his failure to protect his family would torment him into death's cold embrace. For them, they had larger foes to take on. Maul took one more look at Obi-Wan. Tears were falling from his cheeks, and on the ground there was nothing but poison. Maul smiled and turned heel. Crimson Dawn had secured Mandalore. Maul didn't care about the system, but with loyalist Gar Saxon serving him as the ruler in the meantime, he could move on and search for his real foe, Palpatine. Maul's fight with Kenobi only proved to him how far he had come since his return. The work the Great Mothers had done for him— oh, speaking of, Dathomir was coming back to life, and the Night Sisters were reborn with the Great Mothers. But Maul now understood the true grasp of his power. He held a Sith holocron in his hand. He was the true Sith Ari, but it would not be complete until he finished everything he wanted. Sidious had been under the assumption that Maul was dead for the past several years. With Mandalore under assault now, and no definitive sign that his former student was the reason for it, he still had nothing to cite as Maul's return. Sidious didn't believe that Maul would be killed to a survivor of the Jedi Purge, but he did get defeated by Obi-Wan as a Padawan, so stranger things had happened before. Imperial stormtroopers were sent to the front lines to stomp off the incoming coalition fighters. The real difference between each faction was level of training, because most of what the coalition used was what Crimson Dawn used. They didn't have full-blown shipyards. There were a couple Mon Calamari cruisers thrown in for good measure, but for the most part the coalition fleet was comprised of ships from the Clone War. The three-faction war took the galaxy by storm, and because the coalition had lost their leader on Mandalore, in what was still assumed to be an Imperial attack, the coalition became furious fighters. The mistake transmission was a defining moment for this new war, because it changed how people looked at the Empire. Instead of the attack being a rancid raid from a criminal organization, it was seen as a political play, one meant to induce fear. The Empire's entire lifetime had been built around subjugation, and the coalition was very aware of it. If the Empire was who killed Satine, they had fundamentally ruined any chance for peace. In the eyes of many coalition fighters, the neutral systems were a chance to avoid the Empire. Freedom from oppression and subjugation. Satine may have not been perfect, but she gave people a place of sanctuary, a place to be safe. Palpatine was not that person. The malignant attack against their leader rallied a fighting force ready for vengeance. With attention rapidly slipping away from Mandalore and any fighting force sent by the Coalition to recapture it getting completely destroyed, the Coalition focused on moving forward. Sadly, the system of Mandalore was considered lost, and it was very defensible, so the Coalition decided to cut their losses and focus solely on the Imperial front, which worked in their favor. TK troopers were not clones, and they were very easy to break through. The Empire therefore sent Vader to the front lines. This is where Maul and Savage were able to study Darth Vader and get an understanding of what they were dealing with. Savage knew he could take him, and Maul agreed, but they must be patient. They were going for the throat. Attacking the Empire head-on wouldn't be worth their time. Crimson Dawn, instead, played the underworld battle. After all, as a criminal organization, their game was winning where no one was looking. Frontline battles were exciting and even energizing, but a criminal organization like Crimson Dawn could thrive through its quiet warfare with the rest of the galaxy. The Outer Rim was completely secured, and their quote-unquote supplies were in transit to Coalition and Imperial territory. Now, like they had before, it was time to wait. When the time came, about a year into the new war, one that didn't even have an official title, Crimson Dawn made their first move. The Empire spread out to combat the Coalition on the front lines, and just like in the Clone War, it left Coruscant open for an attack. There were Star Destroyers, but they were few and spread out. They were ships of the line and not meant for defense, so all Coruscant had were Venators and of course their new space stations. However, thanks to criminality, these stations were sabotaged and detonated, so it was really devastating for the Empire. The defense fleet was crippled and the massive Crimson Dawn fleet, which had only seen a couple of skirmishes at Mandalore, was launched into a full-blown assault. By this point in the war, no one really knew that Crimson Dawn was actually fighting in this war. It was a three-way war, but only two people were fighting, and no one knew about the third person. Maul and Savage made their way to the surface as Dawn leaders led the combat operations against Imperial officers. The Empire obviously had the strategic mind to win this, but they were simply outnumbered. On the surface, inside the Imperial Palace, Sidious scowled. How could the Coalition reach Coruscant? He never believed that Crimson Dawn would make an attack this vicious. He by this point had made the Senate pretty much useless, so Sidious was honestly just frustrated that the survival of the Duchess during the Clone War and her eventual demise led to this. Vader was by his side, and so was Grand Inquisitor. All of the other Inquisitors had been killed off in frontline battles, so it was just these three, and they were devising an attack. Mon Calamari was the new headquarters for the war effort on the part of the Coalition, and as a result, they were pumping out massive Mon Cala cruisers that had shields that could stand up to the might of the Imperial Star Destroyer cannons. As they were speaking about their strategy for pinning Mon Cala and obliterating it, without the aid of Imperial officers, there was an explosion at the gate. Grand Inquisitor ran in with the Royal Guards. They attacked, but they were subdued by Savage's massive power. The brothers walked forward as Maul told Sidious that he assumed he'd be here, but in a tower of weakness? Really? A man of his talents? calling a former Jedi Temple home was below him. Sidious's expression dropped. Somehow Maul returned again. He told Maul that he should have stayed dead the second time. Maul ignited his lightsaber and told his former teacher that he should have stayed dead. That was correct, but for his sake exclusively. But because he wasn't, he and his pet were now rivals, ones that would now find themselves dead. Sidious was surprised by this confidence, but there was something else. He looked down and saw Maul's intact legs. His former apprentice had reached his full potential. Sidious snarled and launched himself forward. Anakin, inside of Vader, readied himself. He struggled against the likes of Savage as a Jedi, and as he readied his blade, he was shoved backwards. His heels dug into the ground as Savage continued to charge the Sith apprentice. Red lightsabers blasted at each other, master versus master, and apprentice versus apprentice. Maul and Sidious fought with precision, but Maul's speed was starting to eclipse Palpatine's. It was terrifying. He realized that he was nothing compared to his former student, and it would take everything he had to stop Maul from winning this fight. Maul was deadly. He drove and struck wherever he could. This was no longer the master's trained apprentice versus the master. This was an individual who kept what he liked from Palpatine's training and harnessed his own skills and lessons. Maul's power was definitive, and for Sidious, he was stuck in a rapid defense. On the other side of the chambers, Savage, who despite his hulking size, moved loosely between strikes, while also breaking pillars apart and launching them at Imperial Guardsmen trying to disrupt their duels. Vader was only a couple years into his suit, and Savage's skill had quadrupled something that not even Vader could handle in this state. The raw power and anger eclipsed Skywalker's deepest revenge. The Zabrak brothers were signifying the beginning of their own new era with the destruction of the old one. Sidious blasted his lightsabers down on Maul's staff as he spun around, lifting Sidious's weapons off of his own and breaking his saber into two. Maul leapt over and slammed down, forcing one of Sidious's blades to shatter. With the force, Maul launched a shockwave through the ground that ripped through flesh and cloth, as Sidious held his own ground as hard as he could. Maul drove forward again. His master was defenseless. This was a true Sith Ari, something Palpatine could not stop. Sidious shoved his singular defending saber at his former student, but Maul wasn't having it, cutting up and slashing across his hand, ripping Palpatine's blade from his hand and removing his entire wrist. Maul lifted Sidious off the ground with a force and threw him into the ceiling, before dropping him down and ragdolling the Sith Lord multiple times into the ground before throwing him. Sidious rolled across the ground, and Vader saw it from the corner of his mask. Just as he did, Savage lifted Vader off the ground with his pure strength. Vader stumbled, and in his loss of balance he was cut down. His metallic legs were cut out from under him, and a slash was driven across his armor. Vader wailed in pain, as Savage stood over him, pointing his weapon at Vader's throat, and Maul laughed. It started quiet again, but it grew louder and louder. This was their galaxy now. Sidious pleaded for the first time since his apprenticeship to Plagueis the Wise. Maul pitied him. He told Sidious that if he were his master, he would have had the permission to live. But that was not the case. Sidious was no Plagueis, and he was no match for his own raw strength and power. Maul drove his lightsaber down into Sidious's chest, and he looked over to his brother and crossed his arms, asking Savage what he wanted to do with Vader. His brother looked back to him and didn't know. They could kill him. Maul chuckled. Surely they could. But Sidious had done enough damage to Skywalker. That was his name, was it not? Vader didn't say a word. All that could be heard was his broken breathing. Shame. Maul did feel a sense of shame for Vader, but it was apparent that by this point, he and Vader were similar in almost every aspect, subjugated by their master to torment. But this wasn't a time to be remorseful or merciful. Vader had his chance. He saw what Sidious did to him and did nothing. Maul looked to Savage and told him that in an era of two chosen ones, one selected by the Jedi and one created by his own will through Sith power and Dathomiri magic, there was only one chosen one Sith Ari. Sadly for Skywalker or Vader or whatever he wanted to call himself, that was not him. Savage grinned as his blade was driven through Vader's chest. The Skywalkers were all gone. The two Sith would leave. While the war for the galaxy would continue, Coruscant would crumble that night. Maul would assert himself as the ruler of Crimson Dawn, and he would inform the galaxy that those who did not pledge loyalty to his cause would find themselves extinct by the end of the conflict. His message was one with permanence, while his stay on Coruscant was temporary. The Coalition and the Empire had their feud with each other, and he would simply pick off the weaker links, continuing to pin both factions against each other until he rose up from the middle. The war would elongate itself, with more miniature conflicts sprouting up across each sector in the galaxy. The war was divisive, and it continued getting worse, mostly because of Crimson Dawn. Their undercover way of fighting, especially before their assault at Coruscant, gave them the chance to switch the view of the population, because the population saw a view of a war perpetuated by two sides, not the third. The corrupt system promised by Crimson Dawn seemed like the best way to escape this hellish reality. Maul and Savage exploited the people, and Crimson Dawn gained allies across the galaxy through such exploitation. The war continued on much longer than the Clone War ever did. A 7-year conflict would ravage the galaxy. But because Crimson Dawn came in as the quote-unquote underdogs, despite warmongering for years before the war ever began, they looked like heroes of the new age. So much of what Maul understood was framing. It's something he learned from his dear old master. Instead of framing the war as blah blah blah, he focused on how Crimson Dawn looked. Maul didn't go in to seize control over the Empire or the Coalition. Instead, he propositioned a government where there was no government. A system of systems that supported each other but paid tribute to him. He wouldn't control, he wouldn't oversee. He would just hold all the military power in the galaxy, but he would not influence anything other than protection. He was taking what the Hutts, Pikes, Black Suns, and other organizations had been doing for decades and making it a galactic scale thing. It was glorious for him and him alone. He never really followed the true lineage of the Sith, despite being their Sithari. Savage was permitted to train if he wanted, whereas Maul just wanted his own personal star cruiser and a throne, which he got. His life would be filled with riches. He had defeated his rivals. The Jedi and the Sith, as far as he was concerned, were dead. The Night Sister clan, under the guidance of the Great Mothers, had returned, and his life was everything he ever wanted, plus some, in his lifelong retirement in a galaxy now controlled by Crimson Dawn. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all of the patrons: Ezra Wells, Darth Maelstrom, Ozpin, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Brood36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Gallivan Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granite D. Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlinger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewa670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny Naguin, Seth Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fortis Lakes of Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, Man with 3 First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. First things first, I want to address this. The accidental transmission going through is like one of those moments. Like World War III almost started in the 60s because somebody got an order that wasn't actually the order, and so this is kind of like the inverse of that. So it's like one little accident creates a whole other thing. Otherwise, having Maul and Crimson Dawn kind of appear as this third faction is really cool. In the Empire at War game Forces of Corruption, the Zan Consortium is that during the Rebellion era. And I really wanted to play this as a criminal organization would. I wanted to build this up as they were going to do this great big battle, this great big war, and that build it to be there, but it not be fully there. They're building up forces so they could do the underground war, the underground battle, because Crimson Dawn is going to win that battle. They're not going to win on the front lines. I think a coalition force could hold their own against the TK troopers. TK troopers or stormtroopers are just not clones. They're just not. And I think using Clone War tech, which the Empire would still be using, would be the best way to combat that, plus the addition of Mon Cala cruisers. So I think it would just be a really big stalemate, and Crimson Dawn could exploit that really well with an underworld battle, which would allow them to really twist the minds of people into seeing Crimson Dawn as heroes. And that's what really happens at the end there. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.